Portland, Oregon, January 16, 1943, dawn broke over Swan Island with water like polished glass, a brand new T-2 tanker moored quietly at the fitting dock after sea trials, when a rifle shot crack split the morning and then the ship itself, the SS Schenectady, tearing almost in half just aft of the superstructure with a noise heard at least a mile away. Steel shrieked as the hull jackknifed upward from the river, bow and stern sagging while only the bottom plates held, a spectacle so brazen and public that even wartime censorship could not hide it from the eyes of an entire city staring at a modern vessel folding in two under calm skies. No storm had hammered her, no torpedo had struck, and yet the tanker lay bent and broken at the pier, a riddle in plain view that would echo across shipyards and boardrooms. How can a ship fail like this when nothing obvious is wrong? It was not the first crack of the war-built fleet, but it was the moment that made the mystery impossible to ignore, because the Schenectady's failure happened in a safe harbor and in full view, lending shock and urgency to earlier whispers about welded ships splitting unexpectedly in cold conditions. The anxiety had been growing as winter spread down from the North Pacific and across the North Atlantic, places where water temperatures pressed steel toward its hidden limits and turned minor flaws into fatal lines racing through a hull. The Schenectady's break, the newspapers noted, came in calm weather just after sea trials, which only deepened the dread. If a ship could break here, what awaited her sisters on the open ocean? Out at sea, proof would come with merciless clarity on November 24, 1943, when the Liberty ship John P. Gaines broke in two off the Aleutians and sank with 10 lives lost, a catastrophe later tied to the embrittlement of welded steel in freezing waters where toughness vanishes and cracks run unchecked. Investigators and metallurgists began naming factors: steel quality, workmanship, temperature, stress concentration, while a pattern emerged: ships with long, continuous welds and sharp structural details were prone to sudden brittle failure when cold stripped the metal of its ability to absorb strain. Even near New York in March 1943, the tanker Manhattan reportedly broke in two, underlining that the menace was not confined to a single yard or coast but haunted the entire war-built merchant fleet when the thermometer fell and the stress found a corner to concentrate. The first official explanations leaned on familiar culprits: faulty welding and rushed work, because it felt intuitive that speed had simply outrun quality, and early reports pointed to poor practices that undeniably existed in some yards under punishing wartime schedules. But as the evidence grew, the narrative shifted from blame to mechanism. What looked like isolated workmanship errors were, in many cases, symptoms of a deeper physics: the brittle fracture of low-toughness steel at low temperature, ignited at sharp corners and accelerated by continuous welds that handed a crack a clear path. Welded construction eliminated the riveted discontinuities that once acted as brakes, so a fissure born at a square hatch corner under residual tension could sprint across a deck and down a side shell before frames or bulkheads could arrest it, especially when the steel's ductility had collapsed in the cold. That cold mattered more than pride would admit, because steel that bends and forgives in a temperate yard can turn glass hard at sea, crossing an invisible threshold where toughness drops in tiny notches. Tool marks, square cutouts, abrupt geometry, become amplifiers of stress rather than mere imperfections. In those conditions, a weld's heat history and the sequence in which plates are joined can lock residual tensions into the hull, hiding stored energy in quiet steel until a winter night and a sharp corner give that energy a perfect release. The shock of the Schenectady's fracture forced leaders to stare at this convergence of design, material, and method, because the ship had met specifications and yet had failed spectacularly, which meant the specifications themselves might be asking the impossible of the metal and the sea. Behind the headlines lay the industrial gamble that made such failures possible at scale: an unprecedented shift from riveted to welded ships, prefabricated sections marching across assembly lines where speed was the mission and cargo tonnage the weapon, all orchestrated by new yards like Kaiser's on the American West Coast. The Liberty and T-2 programs had proven that ships could be built in weeks, not months, by welding vast steel plates into continuous skins, a miracle that poured hulls into the Atlantic faster than U-boats could sink them, until cracks began to show that speed carried its own invisible toll. What rivets once interrupted, welds now connected seamlessly, what corners once rounded slowly by craft, production sometimes squared and punched for efficiency, and the ocean, indifferent to schedules, found every shortcut the moment the mercury fell. For crews, rumors hardened into fear, because sailors knew that a hull could fail not with a gradual groan but with a single rip, the ship's back breaking in seconds as if an unseen hand had unzipped the steel from hatch to keel in frigid water far from help. They learned to listen to the language of their vessels, the clicks and thuds and winter creaks, and wondered which sound was harmless and which marked the birth of a crack that would not stop until it met a discontinuity or the sea itself. Every voyage through cold lanes became a test of unseen properties, of materials and methods decided in yards thousands of miles away, where a choice about a corner radius or a weld sequence might ripple into life-or-death outcomes at latitude 50 north. The Schenectady's broken back on a quiet river became the emblem for a crisis bigger than one ship, compelling investigators to convene, comb through fractured plates, and re-examine everything from steel chemistry to hatch geometry and the choreography of welders on the line. What began as a story of a single shocking failure widened into a forensic journey through modern shipbuilding, asking not only what failed but why it failed there and then, and what must change if a nation's lifeline is to survive its own ingenuity. The answers would take shape in new procedures, new shapes, and new steels, but in that first stunned moment on the Willamette, all anyone could see was a ship torn open by silence and cold, and the realization that the ocean had found a flaw in the way a war was being won. In the months ahead, the inquiry would turn from spectacle to science, crossing the gap between yards and seas, and laying the groundwork for a transformation that would keep ships from slicing themselves apart when winter pressed down and waves hammered square corners into stress and then into rupture. Yet part 1 ends where the mystery begins, with the shock, the questions, and the sense that something fundamental about steel, shape, and sequence had been misunderstood, because the ocean had just delivered a lesson no one could afford to ignore. The hull on Swan Island was not simply a broken ship, it was a message in twisted plates and a mile-wide echo that demanded a new way to think about building vessels that live where water is hard, wind is sharp, and mistakes travel at the speed of fracture. In the months after Pearl Harbor, the mandate from Washington was simple and brutal: ships must appear faster than the ocean can swallow them, and Henry J. Kaiser stepped into that order with a promise to bend time itself by turning shipbuilding into a choreographed factory of prefabricated parts and welders moving like clockwork around steel. He did it at Richmond, California, where 5 quays and a sprawling grid of sheds and warehouses became the bones of a new idea: take the rhythms of Detroit and bolt them onto the waterfront, so that hull sections, deckhouses, and bulkheads could be built all at once and then swung into place by giant cranes with scarcely a pause between. The result was a spectacle of speed. By late 1942, Liberty ships averaged roughly 6 weeks from keel to launch, a number that sounded like rumor until yards began to post build times like boxing posters, daring each other to beat the bell again and again. The headline belonged to one ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, a feat so improbable that it needed no embellishment, just the dates and hours stamped beside photographs of crews in quilted jackets and paper caps watching a hull glide toward the water. Record keepers would later anoint it formal, the fastest completion of a full-sized ship ever, proof that prefabrication and disciplined welding could make steel obey a schedule as if it were a living thing trained to the whistle. But perhaps the more telling number was not the record, it was the typical. By 1944, the Liberty ship assembly rhythm in Richmond had compressed to a little over 2 weeks, as if the yards had discovered a metronome hidden inside the work itself. At ground level, the secret was not magic, it was movement, the way pre-made sections arrived like clockwork, lifted by cranes from flat cars and cradled into alignment while welders stitched seams in a sequence designed less by old-time shipwright instinct than by production planners armed with charts and stopwatches. Where once a hull grew from the keel upward under a forest of scaffolds, now entire bow and stern modules, engine room blocks, and deckhouses took shape in separate bays, converging on the ways like a convoy timed to the minute. Kaiser's yards became their own geography of motion, moving steel instead of asking men to climb it, and in that inversion lay the speed that would stuff convoys with cargo when the Atlantic needed ships more than it needed elegance. The workforce was as new as the method, a mobilization that redrew the boundaries of who could build a ship and how quickly they could learn to do it, with thousands of women, Wendy the welders, in Richmond's parlance, taking up torches and grinders and learning to read heat and fill a seam with the calm certainty of craftsmen who had never imagined such hands at such work. By 1943, women made up roughly a third of the 90,000-strong Richmond shipyard workforce, sharing the same risks and the same grit, and proving that what mattered most in a crisis was not tradition but throughput, not pedigree but the steady glow of a clean bead in the right place. The symbol the nation chose was a name and a rolled-up sleeve, Rosie the Riveter, but in Richmond the icon wore a hood and gloves and answered to a foreman with a sequence card, and the ship slid down the ways right on time. Scale magnified everything, including pride. Across Kaiser's 4 Richmond yards, more than 747 vessels would be completed, while the broader Kaiser system delivered 1,490 ships, over a quarter of U.S. Maritime Commission output, proving not only that the system worked, but that it could be replicated and multiplied until the schedule itself felt like a weapon. Those statistics are not mere tallies, they are the minutes saved in the assembly bays, the trains that pulled in with prefabricated pieces at dawn, and the cranes that never idled, because idle cranes threw shadows on a war that could not afford them. Every improvement, jigs that caught a plate at the right angle, dollies that turned a section in seconds, a better sequence for attaching stiffeners, stole hours from the calendar and turned them into hulls in convoy. The logic of welding drove this revolution as much as the logistics did, because welding closed seams in a single skin rather than lacing plates together with 1,000 hot rivets, and that continuity meant fewer leaks, cleaner interiors, lighter overall weight, and simpler assembly, boons large enough to sweep away the last reservations of those who loved the old ways. Prefabrication and welding were twins. You could cut and shape a section under cover, fit it to a template, and then carry the whole to the ways and stitch it to the ship in hours, something no riveted tradition could match at that scale and speed. The human body understood this faster than the textbooks. Welders moved less, repeated more, and the work flowed, miles of seam tamed by repetition until the heat and the puddle felt like a second language. Propaganda reels and front-page photos celebrated it with an almost carnival glee, American industry conquering time, and the nation believed because it had to believe that one more line of ships would lift the siege on Britain and drown the U-boats in tonnage and wake. Liberty was no accident of naming. The ships were political vessels as well as cargo carriers, proof that a democracy could become an assembly line long enough to reach both oceans and steady enough to keep its promises. If speed was a melody, then the chorus was manpower made manifest, brown and black and white, men and women, migrants and locals, all trained to the same sequences in the same bays under the same war-sized clock. Yet speed writes in shorthand, and shorthand leaves out the curves, the hesitations, the little flourishes that older builders once added without thinking, especially the habit of rounding a corner rather than punching it square because sailormen knew the sea reads corners like knives. Welding's gift of continuity contained a warning: a continuous skin is a road as much as a wall, and a crack, born of cold or stress or a sharp corner, prefers a road that does not stop at the next plate but goes on and on until something interrupts it. Riveting, by contrast, had once littered a ship with intentional interruptions, hard little commas that forced a crack to pause and dissipate, while a welded plate could carry that same crack like a rumor whispered room to room until the whole house knew. None of that was clear in the first dizzy months of scaling up, and perhaps it could not be, because factories do not produce caution, they produce output, and the war measured output in hulls per month and tons per mile, not in the long quiet of a ship flexing safely through winter seas. The specifications were met, the seams passed inspection, and the schedules turned over like calendar pages in a stiff wind, and then winter came, and with it the revelation that steel has a season and a temperament, and that speed's shadow is the margin it erases. Inside the yards, the answer to every new problem was the same as the answer to the last: train harder, move faster, tighten the choreography, and for a time it worked, because movement itself can drown out doubt until the ocean raises its hand. Rail spurs fed the prefab sheds, and the sheds fed the ways, and the ways fed the river, and on the river a ship became a rumor of its own journey, headed for convoys that needed every ton of flour and fuel they could carry, because the calculus of war was cruel and simple: cargo delivered meant lives saved. Nights in Richmond, crews lit the sky with orange, chalking out welds by arc light and coffee, learning to feel the pull of cooling metal and to stitch plates without tearing the geometry that planners had arranged by the book. They could not know that the book itself still needed a chapter about cold and corners and the speed at which a fisher can learn to run, a chapter the ocean would write in gray water and black moonlight far from the whistles of the bays. Even so, the achievement stands: a nation that had never built at such velocity taught itself to do so, and the evidence was a forest of masts at Anchorage and a river of ships sliding off greased ways in Richmond, Portland, and beyond, each born of 1,000 small, repeated motions that made extraordinary feel ordinary. Speed was not an accident, it was a decision, and the decision brought victory closer by the calendar even as it crept near the edge of what the steel would tolerate, a line unseen until a crack drew it in bright, jagged relief. What came next would be the second lesson of the war-built fleet, that a miracle of production must be followed by a miracle of understanding, or else the ocean will take back what the factories gave, one quiet night at a time. The mystery deepened in the months after the first dramatic breaks, because the welds gleamed, the inspection stamps were crisp, and on paper the ships met their specifications, yet hulls still fractured as if made of porcelain when winter bit the steel and a small flaw found a path to run. Designers pointed to proven plans and qualified materials, and inspectors swore their gauges were honest, but the ocean was not impressed by paperwork, and each new catastrophic crack suggested that something fundamental in the physics of cold steel and continuous welds had been misread. What began as a suspicion of sloppy work matured into a more unsettling idea: the failures might be structural and environmental, not moral or disciplinary, meaning that even good welds and correct plates could be betrayed by temperature, geometry, and the way stress concentrates at certain shapes. Investigators crawled through broken ships with mirrors and chalk, tracing the birthplaces of cracks and finding them again and again at stress razors, square hatch corners, abrupt cutouts, welded intersections, places where the steel's internal loads piled up like traffic onto a narrow bridge with no shoulders. Each corner acted like a magnifying glass for stress, and when winter chilled the plates toward the ductile to brittle transition, those amplified stresses no longer dissipated through yielding but snapped suddenly into a running fracture that outpaced any human response. In warm yards the metal bent, in cold seas it broke, and the difference was not a moral failing of a worker but a material truth about toughness, temperature, and the way a continuous welded skin leaves a crack with nothing to interrupt its journey. Metallurgists reached for language that could hold these events, pointing to notch toughness and the Charpy impact test to explain why steel that absorbs energy at moderate temperatures can surrender that toughness near freezing, turning stress into a clean break rather than a dent or a bend. They spoke of the ductile to brittle transition not as a switch but as a range, a band where a plate can move from forgiving to treacherous in a handful of degrees, and where defects that were once harmless become seeds of catastrophe when the ship crosses that invisible thermal border. The conclusion was unnerving in its simplicity: if notch toughness at service temperature is too low, a sharp corner or a weld flaw can become the trigger for failure, and a welded hull gives the fracture a highway rather than a maze. This is why riveted ships, for all their weight and leaks, seem to resist the same kind of runaway failures. Rivets and lapped plates built discontinuity into the structure, forcing cracks to pause and spend themselves at each mechanical joint rather than sprint through a single, continuous seam. By contrast, welded construction, the miracle that made mass production possible, created uninterrupted paths across decks and side shells, pathways along which a crack, once born, could travel until it met a boundary strong enough to stop it, which often came too late in the cold. Speed had removed the commas and periods in the steel's grammar, and when the sentence of stress ran on in winter, it ended with a jagged full stop that no one wanted to see. The early debate circled predictable culprits: bad steel batches, contaminated welds, poor training, rushed inspections, because those are things a yard can fix with discipline and time, and to be fair, some breaks did start where a flawed bead or a slag inclusion left a notch waiting to grow. But the broader pattern refused to be explained away by workmanship alone, because the casualty rate spiked in cold weather and rough seas, and tests on salvaged plates revealed transition temperatures high enough that the North Atlantic's winter made them notch brittle by default. Blaming hands could not help a hull that had the wrong toughness for its theater, and so the conversation turned to properties and shapes rather than merely to speed and supervision. Constance Tipper's work crystallized this shift, showing that welded ship steels could fail by brittle fracture at low temperature even when tensile strength seemed adequate, and that fracture was governed by how a crack tip concentrates stress rather than by average loads across a plate. Out of such studies grew fracture mechanics, a way to quantify how a crack behaves, to measure a stress intensity factor Kk and compare it to a material's fracture toughness Kc, and to judge safety not by a single strength number but by whether a flaw can grow under service conditions. This thinking placed the hatch corner and the weld toe under a microscope, because in those places Kk shoots upward, and if the sea is cold and the toughness low, the inequality tilts toward failure long before a sailor feels anything under his boots. Design details that once looked like conveniences, rectangular openings for cargo, snappy cutouts to speed fabrication, turned out to be stress amplifiers, multiplying local loads and guaranteeing that if a crack began, it would begin there, especially under torsion and bending as the hull writhed in heavy seas. Rounding those corners, thickening at transitions, and softening geometry would become the obvious remedies later, but in the early months the fleet sailed with the squares it had, and the ocean read those squares like invitations. Numerical studies and service experience converged on the same lesson: geometry is not decoration on a ship, it is how stress chooses its path in metal that cannot argue with winter or with waves. Residual stress, the ghost written into the steel by welding heat and cooling, complicated everything, because a plate could be born already tense inside, carrying loads no gauge could see until the cold made them matter and a notch gave them a voice. When investigators mapped crack paths after failures, they often saw how internal tensions aligned with external bending to push a flaw across a seam and into a plate edge, accelerating a fracture that might otherwise have stalled in warmer water or at a riveted splice. In some Schenectady accounts, residual stress was singled out as the main driver, a reminder that sequence and heat history are not footnotes to design but part of the structure's fate. Routing changes tried to buy safety by steering vulnerable ships toward calmer, warmer routes, tacitly admitting that the steel, the shapes, and the welds were not yet aligned with the seas they had to face, even as design modifications waited their turn in the drafting rooms. At the same time, classification rules and specifications began to evolve, calling for impact-tested steels with lower transition temperatures so that toughness would remain in the tank when the barometer fell and the spray froze on the guardrails. The fleet was learning, painfully and publicly, that safety at sea begins long before launch day, in metallurgical choices and corner radii that decide whether stress will be stored, released, or relieved when the ship meets winter. For crews, all of this translated into a new superstition that was really physics in disguise: avoid the cold lanes if you can, watch the corners if you cannot, and listen to the hull at night because the first sign of a brittle world is a sound too clean for comfort. For the yards, it meant that the next generation of ships would have to be drawn with rounded language and built with procedures that bleed stress away before the ocean collects it, turning production miracles into structures that can suffer without shattering. Between those realizations lay the pivot from mystery to method, from guessing at blame to measuring at the crack tip, and that pivot would shape everything that followed, from redesigned openings to deliberate crack arresters threaded through the length of a hull. The investigation no longer asked merely whether a weld was good, but whether the steel stayed tough at the temperatures it would meet, whether the corner multiplied stress beyond forgiveness, and whether the structure contained an intentional interruption to stop a running flaw before it reached the keel. In the end, the enigma of ships that broke in calm water was resolved not by a single culprit but by a chorus: cold that steals ductility, corners that hoard stress, continuous welds that offer a perfect road, and residual tensions waiting for a reason to move. The cure would be plural too: better steels, kinder geometry, planned discontinuities, and a new respect for the way welding writes its own history into the metal, because the ocean does not grade on a curve, and winter does not negotiate. Inside the prefab shed, a night's work began with a hiss and a bloom of light, and welders learned early that the order of their beads could teach the steel to lie straight, or to pull itself into a quiet, dangerous twist that no level could deny by morning's inspection. When a long seam was run from one end to the other without pause, cooling contraction tugged the plates into a bow, and even when the eye could not see the curve, residual stresses accumulated along the weld toe like ghost loads waiting for a reason to move when cold seas and hull bending gave them one. The discovery was tactile before it was theoretical: set the sequence wrong and the panel warped under your gloves, set it right and the piece relaxed into place, proof that welding is not only joining but also writing invisible history into the metal with every heat cycle and every pause chosen by the torchman. Residual stress is the mark left by heat that expands the steel beyond its neighbors and then forces it to shrink back against colder material that refuses to follow, locking tension into the microstructure that cannot be measured by a tape but manifests when service loads and temperature conspire to add 1 ounce too many. In ship hulls, those locked-in tensions whittle away safety margins because a plate that begins under longitudinal pull needs less ocean to reach its limit, and when the thermometer falls toward the ductile to brittle transition, the same internal tension that meant nothing in the shed becomes fuel for a crack once a notch provides a spark. The welder's dilemma, then, is a choreography problem disguised as metallurgy: weld in an order that spreads heat and contraction so the stress bleeds to the edges, not the center, alternate sides and seams, let sections cool before closing a loop that traps strain in the worst possible place. Analysts later mapped these instincts to numbers, showing how different sequences redistribute transverse and longitudinal residual stresses, and how alternating weld lines or skip welding could cut peak stresses at the weld toe where cracks love to begin under cyclic bending at sea. Finite element studies on stiffened panels confirmed what fitters had sensed for months: that residual stresses and distortions reduce ultimate strength by double-digit percentages in the wrong combinations, and that controlled sequencing and restraint can recover a surprising share of that lost capacity before the hull ever leaves the ways. Even choices that minimize distortion did not always minimize residual stress, a trade-off that forced planners to balance flatness, lock tension, and fatigue life instead of chasing one metric that could betray them in winter swells. On deck plans, certain shapes betrayed the ship every time, and welders knew their names by where the cracks began: hatch corners cut square for speed, sharp transitions at gun tubs or deck openings, and intersecting seams that bundled stress like a fist clenched in steel. A square corner is a magnifier, and under longitudinal bending and torsion, it piles extra stress at the radius that does not exist, which is why the sea often traced the first bright line there when plates were cold and residual tension was already humming under the paint. Rounding those corners is not ornament, it is a structural lullaby that lowers the stress concentration so a hull can flex without turning a notch into a fault line when the ship shoulders into a beam sea in February. Riveted ships once survived because their skins were full of interruptions. A crack had to fight to cross a line of rivets and overlapping plates, while an all-welded hull offers a continuous roadway along which a flaw can accelerate until something deliberate stops it, if anything deliberate was placed at all. Welding delivered the miracle of speed through continuity and prefab blocks, but that same continuity is what makes a crack so fast once it is born, which is why later remedies deliberately inserted crack arresters at intervals, conceding that sometimes the safest path is to design for failure to halt rather than never begin. To the welder at the panel, this translated into procedures that felt fussy in the moment: start at the center, alternate positions, stagger heat input, respect interpass cooling, but paid dividends at sea where the only inspector left is the wave that measures every shortcut without mercy. Control of interpass temperature became a kind of discipline inside the discipline, because overheat the region and the grain grows and the toughness falls, while rushing passes without letting heat soak and dissipate compounds the very residual tensions the sequence was meant to cure. Sequence cards and chalk marks on jigs were not bureaucracy, they were the difference between a module that arrived flat and calm and one that needed to be forced into alignment, carrying hidden resentment that the ocean would exploit at the first cold snap. The better the choreography in the shed, the kinder the ship's behavior in winter, because a hull is only a sum of plates and welds, and if those pieces begin their life already arguing, the sea will referee with a verdict no captain can appeal. In failure investigations, fracture paths often traced back to weld toes at openings, or to places where intersecting seams concentrated stress in three directions at once, and post-mortem measurements of plate flatness told the same tale of sequences run straight through rather than balanced across the geometry. Where studies compared alternate sequences, the patterns were clear. Alternating directions and distributing beads symmetrically lowered peak transverse residual stress by significant margins, especially near toes and heat-affected zones where microscopic flaws are most dangerous under bending. These insights did not absolve workmanship, they refined it, turning good welding from a matter of neat beads into an orchestral problem of when and where to play each note so the music does not sour in the cold. Shop veterans had a phrase for it, let the steel breathe. And while that sounds mystical, the physics is sober. Each weld expands then shrinks a strip of metal, and if those strips are pulled in the wrong order, they clamp a panel like a Titan drumhead, ready to split along the first scratch that lines up with the load. Run a long seam to the bitter end without relief and the contraction tethers the plate to a straitjacket of its own making, whereas stitching the seam in balanced increments lets contraction cancel itself and leaves the panel with far less reason to betray the ship later. Nothing about this is romantic, and everything about it is practical, because what begins as a decision about where to strike an arc becomes, months later, a question of whether a crew hears a harmless tick or the start of a line that will not stop until daylight. The welder's vantage point also exposed a final irony. Speed is not only how fast a bead runs, it is how cleverly time is spent between beads, cooling pauses, alternating sides, and staging modules so every joint is made under conditions that favor toughness and flatness rather than throughput alone. Done well, this invisible patience saves more hours than it costs, because modules that arrive stress-relieved and true do not fight the ship on assembly, and ships that do not fight themselves at launch are less likely to fight the ocean to survive the winter lanes. In the end, the frontline lesson was stark and transferable. Sequence is structure. Heat is history, corners are choices, and continuity is a promise that must be interrupted on purpose if a flaw is ever born, because the ocean is always reading the blueprint we wrote in light and steel long before the keel touched water. The turning point began not with a single memo but with a reckoning. If ships could break in calm water, the war could be lost in spreadsheets and steel. So Washington chartered a board of investigation in 1943 to probe design and construction of welded merchant ships, a move that birthed the Ship Structure Committee to pursue root causes instead of rumors. Chaired under the Secretary of the Navy's authority and drawing leaders from the Coast Guard, Bureau of Ships, the Maritime Commission, and the American Bureau of Shipping, the board treated brittle fracture as a national emergency, formalizing a program of research and standards that would change how ships were drawn and built from keel to mast. The message to the yards was plain and hard: fix the problem at its sources, design geometry, material toughness, and fabrication practice, or winter seas would continue grading the fleet on failure rather than on speed. At Richmond, where Kaiser's system had already reinvented the calendar with prefabrication and round-the-clock welding, the correction took shape as orchestration rather than heroics, more discipline in how modules were produced, tighter inspection regimes, and a production flow that privileged structural integrity alongside throughput. Prefabrication was preserved but matured. Bigger subassemblies were built under cover with better jigs and staging, then married on the ways with an eye toward alignment that reduced fit-up forcing and the hidden tensions it leaves behind. The yards did not abandon what made them fast. They tuned it, turning the assembly line into choreography where parts arrived truer, inspections cut deeper, and the sea was treated as the final auditor rather than an afterthought. The strategic pivot crystallized in a new class of ships whose very lines announced a different philosophy. Victory-class cargo vessels, laid down in Richmond beginning January 17, 1944, were conceived to be stronger in the ways that mattered and faster in the lanes where speed itself was survival. Their propulsion modernization, oil-fired steam turbines in most hulls, pushed sustained service speeds into the 15, 17 knot range, a decisive leap beyond Liberty performance that shrank exposure time to U-boat waters while carrying the same lifeblood of cargo. The speed read as confidence, but the real confidence was structural, a hull meant to flex with the sea rather than fight it to the breaking point. Where Liberty ships had frames on 30-inch centers that made hulls stiffer and prone to transmitting stress, Victory ships widened frame spacing to 36 inches, trading a bit of rigidity for a valuable ability to absorb and distribute wave-induced bending without concentrating loads to the point of fracture. The choice acknowledged the ocean's terms. Continuous welded skins need controlled flexibility, and the Victory's framing geometry wrote that lesson into steel so bending was work the ship could do, not a bill coming due in a single cold instant. This was not a rejection of welding, it was welding with a structural strategy, a hull that bent enough to keep its promises when winter demanded proof. Designers also embedded arrest features and details that acted like speed bumps in a welded world, with angle iron crack arresters placed at vital locations to prevent a local flaw from sprinting across decks and side shells as it had in the worst Liberty casualties. A raised forecastle improved seaworthiness by shedding green water that once pounded the well deck, moderating repeated stress cycles that add up over weeks into the kind of cumulative fatigue a brittle plate cannot forgive in February. Even cargo handling changed character, 7 sets of cargo gear across 5 hatches, electrically powered winches, and refined layouts that balanced service efficiency with structural continuity rather than treating those priorities as enemies. The act of redesign rippled backward into the sheds, where process discipline tightened because the new ships could only meet their promise if the modules that fed the ways arrived straight, within tolerance, and already screened for the kind of defects that winter loves to find. Welding practice and inspection became more exacting, with the understanding, reinforced by wartime investigations, that brittle fracture is a system failure, temperature, geometry, residual stress, and flaws must align, so the task was to disrupt that alignment at every step. Welding's advantages remained, but the yards conceded what the ocean had taught. Inspections demand greater attention for welded skins, and the cost of vigilance is less than the price of a hull that unzips at sea. The context for this zeal was brutal arithmetic. Brittleness and cracking afflicted a large share of the Liberty fleet to one degree or another, a reality that forced planners to treat crack prevention and arrest as primary design goals rather than late-stage fixes. That admission also reframed speed, no longer an idol in itself, but a measure that had to be reconciled with toughness at service temperature and details that diffuse stress where the hull is most vulnerable. The Victory template thus represented a pact between factory and ocean: keep the tempo, but build elasticity and arrest into every span so the sea finds no straight line to ruin. Leadership's clearest contribution was structural humility elevated to policy: accept that the hull must flex, that cracks must be trapped before they grow, and that process control in the shed is as vital to survival as horsepower in the engine room. Frame spacing is only a number until night seas set the ship on a long bend. Crack arresters are only angle irons until a bright line pauses at their edge, and prefabrication is only a miracle until a module arrives carrying tension it should have bled in the bay, not offshore. The overhaul did not simply make ships faster or prettier, it made them survivable by design, a lesson purchased on the ledger of earlier fractures and paid forward in hulls that could suffer and still come home. By late 1944, the difference was visible in silhouettes and measurable in service. Victories ran harder and arrived more intact, testifying that the fix required a system, from committee rooms and drawing boards to sheds and gantries, aligned around toughness, flexibility, and interruption of failure paths. What began as a crisis of confidence in welded ships became a disciplined language for building them right, with the Maritime Commission, naval bureaus, and yards working from the same grammar of cold, corner, and crack, and writing fewer tragedies into the wake. The pivot was never about abandoning speed, it was about earning it back under winter skies by changing how the steel was asked to carry the load, and that is what the Victory ships and the Titan processes delivered to convoys that could not afford another surprise. The redesign began where stress made itself visible, at the edges and openings, in the ways a square corner punished steel, so shipwrights took erasers to right angles and replaced them with radiused hatch corners that turned stress spikes into gradients the metal could carry without turning brittle silence into a sprinting crack. Tests and service records from the post-war analysis of hatch corner designs confirmed what welders and sailors had learned the hard way: careful attention to corner geometry dramatically improved performance, with rounded combing arrangements proving far less prone to initiating fractures than the hard 90-degree intersections that had haunted earlier decks. It was a change anyone could see walking a Victory's deck: corners softened not for beauty but for survival, and beneath that curve lay a simple truth: the sea reads geometry, and a circle is kinder to steel than a square when winter asks a ship to bend without breaking. The hull's inner rhythm changed too, with frames pulled farther apart, 36 inches rather than the Liberty's 30, so the structure could flex with the sea instead of bracing against it until something snapped, a deliberate trade of stiffness for resilience written into the class from the design stage. That extra space between frames reads like a small number on paper, but in a welded hull it is a different philosophy: permit global bending to spread loads and avoid concentrating them where cracks are born, especially in way of openings and long welded runs. A welded ship cannot rely on riveted seams to slow a flaw, it must instead shape its skeleton to share punishment, and the Victory's wider frame spacing answered that challenge with a structure that worked with the ocean rather than against it. Along the length of deck and side shell, designers added deliberate interruptions to continuity, crack arresters that act like speed bumps for fractures, because a welded plate offers a perfect road unless something engineered stands in the way to absorb and stop a running flaw. These arresters, typically in the form of plates or strakes embedded to match the surrounding thickness, were placed strategically along midship spans where global bending is worst, sized and located so they could halt a moving crack rather than merely watch it pass by. Design guidance matured to specify width and arrangement so that reloading after arrest would not simply reinitiate tearing, elevating crack arrest from a hopeful detail to a quantified defense written into the ship's backbone. Not every interruption needed to be heavy, some were simply smarter seams and transitions that refused to draw hard lines in the steel, improving local details so a deck beam met a hatch combing with tapered loads rather than abrupt knuckles where stress could pile up and wait for a cold night. The Ship Structure Committee's push for improved hull details codified small changes that paid large dividends: gentler cutouts, fair transitions, brackets, and doublers shaped to ease stress, turning 1,000 tiny hazards into 1,000 small safeties. In aggregate, the details rewrote how a ship feels stress at the places sailors walk and work, taking the edge off every edge until the deck itself was less eager to betray the hull under winter bending. Above the waterline, the silhouette changed to spare the structure below, with a raised forecastle on many Victories reducing boarding seas that once hammered well decks and drove relentless fatigue into the forward structure on Liberties. Less green water on deck meant fewer violent cycles transmitted through hatch corners and deck plating, marrying seakeeping to structural longevity in a way that made sense to engineers and to crews mopping ice in February. Cargo arrangements were refined as well: 5 hatches serviced by 7 sets of gear with electric winches, balancing operational tempo with cleaner structural paths so service speed did not come at the cost of stress hotspots. The most elegant fixes were often the least dramatic: a radius here, a doubler there, a combing that carried stress down into a deck girder gradually rather than dumping it at a weld toe, all of it guided by the same principle that smoothed the hatch corners: the sea punishes spikes, so draw curves. Where rectangular openings remained necessary, designers learned to square only the cover at the combing top while keeping the structural corner rounded beneath, preserving function for cargo while protecting the strength member from the worst stress concentration. This kind of layered design, geometry for operations above, geometry for strength below, turned compromise into craft, acknowledging that ships must work as well as survive. Beneath the skin, structural continuity was tuned rather than taken for granted, with designers accepting that welded continuity is both a gift and a threat and answering it with planned discontinuities, arresters, transitions, segmented paths, so a flaw would burn out before it found a straight road. Guidance evolved to place arresters along the central 3/5 of the vessel where bending is most severe, not as an afterthought but as an integral belt within the ship's mid-body, quietly ready for an emergency no one wants to meet. By matching arrestor thickness to surrounding plating, detailers avoided creating new stress risers at the very place meant to save the ship, an example of how every fix must be drawn to do no harm before it does its good. Down in the sheds, these choices simplified some fights and complicated others. Rounded corners and improved cutouts were easier to keep sound under weld heat, but the precision they demanded required jigs, templates, and an inspector's temperament long before the module met the ways. Yet this care repaid itself at assembly, where modules aligned without brute force and deck seams closed without prying plates into position, reducing the hidden residual stresses that stockpiled trouble in earlier builds. In a factory that measured time by cranes and shifts, this was the quietest kind of efficiency: fewer reworks, cleaner fits, and less tension carried to sea as an unpaid debt. Walk of victory with a carpenter's eye, and the story is legible in steel: the softened corners at each hatch, the wider rhythm of frames behind the plates, the subtle arresters stitched into spans that once would have been uninterrupted, all hinting at a conversation with the ocean that learned its lessons the hard way. Listen at the combing and the geometry explains itself. Look along the deck and count the places where a crack would have to stop and think. Trace the mid-body and sense how the hull is allowed to breathe with a sea that never stops asking its questions. None of these details alone would have been enough, but together they turn continuity into controlled continuity, stiffness into strength, and corners into curves that carried ships through winters that once snapped them in two. The result was not simply fewer failures but a calmness in the way the hull moved, a sense that the ship could flex and then forgive itself for flexing, which is the only kind of strength that matters when a convoy runs into the kind of weather that writes names on memorials. It is easy to cheer speed and tonnage, but the design fixes that audiences can see, the rounded corners, the spread of frames, the quiet strip of arrestor plate underfoot, are the reasons ships could come home with stories rather than excuses. A welded fleet learned to interrupt its own perfection so that its flaws would never get the last word, and in that paradox lies the secret to how the war's fastest ships also became its most durable in the seas that tried hardest to break them. Steel had to change because the sea does not negotiate, and the lesson from brittle fractures was blunt: toughness at service temperature matters more than nominal strength on paper when a welded hull faces winter seas and sharp geometry. Investigators tied the crisis to low-notch toughness at low temperatures, with cracks igniting at weld toes and square corners, then racing across continuous plates fueled by residual stress and a steel that had slipped below its ductile to brittle transition range. From that moment forward, impact toughness and the transition curve, not just room temperature tensile tests, became the compass for any ship steel meant to survive the North Atlantic in February. The Charpy impact test emerged as the yardstick for this new thinking, a simple, standardized hammer blow that measured energy absorbed by a notched specimen and traced out the S-curve of ductile to brittle transition across temperature. This test, refined and maintained by NIST and others, made it possible to select steels whose absorbed energy remained high in cold service, shrinking the transition temperature so that winter seas did not turn the hull into glass. Where old specifications spoke in ultimate strengths, new requirements spoke in impacts and transition bands, translating a ship's fate into jowls at the notch because that is where fractures begin in the real world. Metallurgists attacked the problem where it lived, in chemistry and microstructure, lowering carbon and boosting manganese to improve low-temperature toughness while cutting impurity levels that raise transition temperatures or embrittle weld zones. The principle is well established. Manganese strengthens the ferrite matrix and ties up sulfur as MnS, while a lower carbon content and cleaner steel reduce brittle phases and notch sensitivity that conspire against impact energy at low temperature. Industrial guidance born from these crises pushed plate makers toward fully killed, fine-grained carbon, manganese steels to guarantee weldability and toughness tailored to service conditions, not just to heat numbers on a mill cert. Killed steel mattered because deoxidizing with aluminum or silicon prevents gas porosity and promotes fine grain, raising toughness and delivering predictable impact behavior down in the cold range where the fleet actually sails. Fine-grained, fully killed steels resist cleavage fracture more effectively, shifting the transition to lower temperatures so that a hatch corner in January is less likely to launch a running crack. This is the quiet alchemy of safety. The steel's birth chemistry and deoxidation practice determine how it will behave years later, when stress and cold arrive together under a black sky. Nickel and other alloying strategies added another lever, because small additions of nickel are known to improve low-temperature toughness in ferritic steels by stabilizing tougher microstructures without sacrificing weldability when carefully balanced. Modern research and naval practice alike show that composition tuning, Mn for strength and sulfur control, Ni for low-temperature toughness, controlled carbon for weldability, can move transition temperatures by tens of degrees, which is the difference between a flex and a fracture at sea. What the war forced was not exotic steel so much as appropriate steel, calibrated for the thermal reality of the North Atlantic instead of the comfort of a warm yard. The brittle failures also pushed engineering toward fracture mechanics, reframing safety as a comparison between the crack tip stress intensity Kk and the material's fracture toughness Kc, not simply as an average stress versus yield strength problem. This shift explained why ships could fail suddenly below the transition. Once a notch forms and Kk exceeds Kc at low temperature, the crack accelerates regardless of the nominal stress the rest of the structure can still carry, especially in a continuous welded skin. Design, material, and inspection thus became a single system: lower the transition, blunt the notch, and ensure inspections find small flaws before cold turns them into decisive ones. Evidence from casualty patterns confirmed that the worst brittle fractures clustered in winter and declined as post-war steels and details improved, reflecting the direct impact of tougher plate, better corners, and more deliberate fabrication on real-world casualty rates. In other words, the fleet taught the mills what to make, and the mills returned steels that taught ships how to behave, closing the loop between sea and specification that had been dangerously open in 1942. The outcome was not immunity, but resilience, the ability of a welded ship to carry stress, absorb impact, and deny a tiny flaw the conditions it needs to become a story for a board of inquiry. Ship rules and classification standards absorbed these lessons, specifying impact-tested, fully killed fine-grained steels for low-temperature service and tying acceptance to Charpy performance at defined temperatures rather than to a single ambient strength metric. That linkage between service environment and certified toughness turned procurement into prevention, ensuring that the plate rolling out of mills had the ductility to match the routes ships would sail. A specification became a promise kept in ice and wind, not just a paper yardstick in a warm inspection bay. Even today, metallurgical reviews return to the same fundamentals that World War II wrote in hard ink: chemistry, microstructure, and cleanliness set the stage, while notch geometry and loading rate decide the final act when temperatures sink toward the transition. Research continues to refine by night, ferrite balances and inclusion control for high-strength, high-toughness ship plate, pushing for steels that can be welded quickly yet remain forgiving under cold, cyclic loads that define ocean service. The North still tests every promise a steel mill makes, and the Charpy pendulum still asks the question in miniature before the waves ask it for real. Material change did not replace design change, it empowered it, because rounded corners and crack arresters only matter if the plate can absorb energy at the temperature where they are called upon to work. Lower transition temperatures, cleaner weld zones, and controlled compositions transformed those geometric fixes from good intentions into reliable defenses, turning a single brittle flaw into a contained repair instead of a headline. That is how metallurgy made architecture honest, by giving the steel enough grace at the notch in winter to survive the moment that once split ships in two. The transformation from blueprint to workflow began in the prefab sheds, where weld maps and sequence plans turned steel into choreography, because the only way to keep stress from accumulating in a welded ship was to decide, before the first arc struck, exactly where and when heat would enter the panel and where it would be allowed to leave. Supervisors walked the bays with drawings and chalk, marking starts and stops so long seams were broken into balanced passes, an alternating rhythm that reduced distortion and spread residual tension toward the edges rather than locking it into the heart of a plate that would later face winter bending at sea. Module by module, the sheds began to produce assemblies that were not just complete, but quiet, flat where they needed to be, true where they would mate on the ways, so that the hull would not inherit hidden arguments the ocean could exploit. Prefabrication was the skeleton key, and Richmond's yards refined it to the minute, staging frames, deckhouses, and side shells so cranes could lift and place them in a flow that felt more like an orchestra than a construction site, with fewer pauses and fewer forced fits that had once stored trouble in the joints. The logic was simple: the less a module had to be coerced into alignment, the less residual stress it carried into the structure, and the more likely the finished hull could flex as designed rather than as a record of every pry bar used to make mismatched edges touch. Productivity improved because geometry improved, and geometry improved because planning stepped into the shed and refused to leave engineering at the office door. Discipline and sequence changed the metal's biography, because the order of welds decides how plates breathe during cooling, and alternating runs across a panel can lower peak residual stresses at weld toes that would otherwise become crack origins under cyclic load in service. Analytical studies and yard experience converged on the same conclusion: skip welding patterns, symmetry, and restraint reduce both distortion and stress, raising panel capacity before a ship ever meets the first winter swell. Every avoided continuous run was a line the ocean would not get to read back at speed when the temperature dropped and the hull went into a long, slow bend. Interpass temperature and heat input became everyday language, reinforced by training that linked thin plate distortion control to weld size, arc time, and spacing, so welders knew when to wait and why waiting mattered as much as striking the next bead. The curriculum of shipyard welding matured from "make it stay" to "make it stay and stay tough," entwining first-time quality with distortion mitigation so that the best-looking panel was also the one least likely to carry residual tension as a hidden cost. This was not cautious for caution's sake, it was throughput made reliable, because a module that arrives true saves rework and prevents stress inheritance that no inspector can erase later. Inspection, too, changed its center of gravity, expanding from visual checks to include non-destructive methods where they counted most, with radiography used for critical welds in some yards to find porosity, slag, or slugging long before sea trials could turn those defects into disasters. A post-war committee even credited one tanker shipyard's exceptionally low failure rate to extensive radiographic inspection, a stark reminder that catching flaws in the shed is cheaper than reading them under starlight at sea. Magnetic particle inspection, whose techniques matured commercially in the 1920s and standardized in industry by the 1930s, provided another non-destructive eye for surface-breaking cracks on ferromagnetic weldments, complementing radiography with speed and sensitivity where it fit the work. The inspection apparatus didn't eliminate visual craft, it sharpened it, training crews to see heat tint, bead profile, undercut, arc strikes, and toe blending as early signs of how a joint would live under load, and to escalate what couldn't be trusted to methods that could see beneath the surface. Documentation followed the rigor, with weld maps, repair logs, and inspection records knitting quality control into production rather than treating it as a final hurdle, so that a ship's documentary trail matched its structural truth. This created feedback loops that reached designers and planners quickly, turning every catch into a lesson about detail, sequencing, or fit-up before the mistake could repeat across a run of modules. Orchestration on the ways refined the shed's promise. Modules arrived on timed cranes, were set on prepared foundations, and closed with welds that respected the same balanced sequences used in sub-assembly, so the final joins did not undo the stress gains earned indoors. Assembly order itself became a structural choice, with planners sequencing lifts to minimize locked-in twist along the hull and to avoid long, continuous closures that would shrink like belts around the mid-body. What looked like speed from the pier was discipline inside, a refusal to trade the last hour saved on the schedule for an hour borrowed against the ship's winter future. Training never stopped, because turnover and scale demanded that expertise be manufactured as deliberately as steel plate, and the machine shops and classrooms at Richmond became factories for craft knowledge as much as for parts. The same workforce mobilization that had brought new welders to the bays now brought them up the curve in stress management, distortion control, and inspection literacy, so quality did not depend on a handful of old hands. Every shift learned the same language: sequence is structure, heat is history, inspection is prevention, not punishment, and the ocean will audit whatever the yard ignores. Process control at scale required logistics as much as metallurgy, with materials kit to the weld plan and jigs designed to enforce geometry without brute force, so fit-up pressure didn't become a silent load written into the ship. Cranes, tracks, and staging were scheduled to avoid idle time that seduces crews into welding straight through a seam just to keep busy, a habit that raises heat input and residual stress for no structural gain. In this way, production tempo became a guardrail for quality, not a rival, keeping the line moving in rhythms that sustained both throughput and structural integrity. Standards and committees provided the spine for these changes, translating lessons from failures into guidance and rules that tied acceptance to method, detail, and documentation rather than to hope, and pushing yards to prove the steel and the geometry at the notch, not just the average strength on a mill sheet. Investigations into brittle fracture codified the connection between design detail, material toughness, and fabrication practice, ensuring that the next generation of welded ships would be born with fewer pathways for cracks to run. The result was not merely compliance but a culture change. Quality became part of the tact, not a pause between beats. By the time victories were flowing off the ways, the cumulative effect of these practices was visible in service: fewer crack reports, better tolerance of harsh routes, and a confidence among crews that the hull would flex and hold rather than unzip under a hard night. Process had become structure: balanced sequences in modules, careful closures on the ways, smarter details at openings, and inspections that caught flaws as a matter of course, not as a miracle. This is how ships stopped carrying the shed's mistakes to sea, by refusing to let stress accumulate invisibly in the first place, and by treating every pass of the arc as an engineering decision with a wake somewhere downrange. None of this reduced the need for good steel or kinder geometry; it made them work, because even the best plate and the roundest corner can be betrayed by a sequence that traps tension where the sea will later tug. The blueprints lines meant little without the shed's choreography, and the choreography would have failed without inspection's eyes. Together they turn prefabrication from speed alone into speed with memory, a hull that remembers how it was made in the way it survives a winter crossing. What had begun as a miracle of output matured into a system of prevention, a factory that manufactured resilience on purpose rather than discovering it by luck. In the end, this was the quiet victory: modules arriving calm, seams closing without a fight, records that could be read like a promise, and ships that met February as if it had been part of their design brief all along, because in truth, it finally was. From shed to ways to wake, the work learned to bleed stress where it could and to block it where it must, so a crack, if it ever began, would meet resistance, not a runway, and the crew would never hear that clean, terrible sound in the dark. Production kept its pace, but now the ocean had fewer invitations, and the ships had more ways to say no. By mid-1944 the new ships were not just lines on a drawing but hulls in convoy, and the difference could be felt in the wake. Victory ships ran at 15 to 17 knots, a full stride faster than their predecessors, cutting exposure in dangerous waters and smoothing the timetable of a war that measured success in days gained and tonnage delivered. That speed came from modern oil-fired turbines and a more efficient hull, turning a cargo vessel into a ship that could keep pace with faster lanes and avoid the slow convoys that once made Liberty's easy marks for submarines. Even before crews learned the new engine rooms by heart, they understood what 4 to 6 extra knots meant in the North Atlantic, fewer hours in the killing zones, and a logistics chain that finally stopped apologizing to the calendar. But it wasn't speed alone that altered the story at sea. The structure itself had been changed to bend with weather rather than brace until something snapped, with frame spacing widened from 30 to 36 inches so the welded skin could flex without driving stress into the sharp corners and long seams that had betrayed earlier ships. That one quiet number threaded through the hull, the rhythm of frames behind the plating, translated into a ship that rode heavy seas with less complaint and fewer of the sudden, merciless fractures that had once begun at a hatch corner on a cold night. It was an admission written into steel that a welded vessel needs deliberate flexibility, and that the best way to keep a crack from running is to give stress somewhere kinder to go. Designers then seeded the deck and sides with deliberate interruptions, crack arrest features and improved details, so that if a flaw ever began, it would meet a wall rather than a runway, a change as plain as the rounded hatch corners and as hidden as the arresting strakes buried in the plating. A raised forecastle did its own quiet work, throwing less green water onto the well deck and taking the sting out of the repeated blows that fatigue a forward hull in winter, turning seakeeping into structural medicine before the doctor is needed. Even cargo arrangements, 5 hatches, 7 sets of gear, electric winches, were laid out to move freight fast without carving stress traps into the path the metal would have to carry for months at sea. The proof did not arrive in a single triumph but in the absence of familiar alarms, fewer urgent inspection reports, fewer cracks traced in chalk around hatch corners, fewer whispers in mess halls when the barometer fell and the sea began to lean on the hull. The casualty pattern that had dogged the Liberty fleet through winters, nearly 1,500 significant brittle fractures and a grim handful of dramatic breaks, receded as victories took on the same routes with structures designed to distribute loads and halt flaws before they became headlines. Crews learned to trust the new rhythm of the ship, a confidence born not of optimism but of fewer bad surprises when the thermometer flirted with freezing and the deck went white with rime. That trust was earned on the worst water, where the benefit of an extra 4 to 6 knots is measured not in theory but in the hours a convoy spends within range of a wolf pack, and where hulls that flex and forgive matter more than posters and promises. Shorter exposure times multiplied across thousands of voyages, turning a design decision about engines and framing into a statistical shield for cargoes that could not be replaced and men who could not be spared. In this way, machinery and metallurgy joined strategy, because a faster, tougher ship removes chances for the enemy long before a periscope appears. Comparisons with the older fleet were unavoidable and instructive. Where welded continuity had once offered a perfect road for a crack, Victory hulls scattered potential pathways with curves, arrests, and more merciful framing, reducing the odds that a single flaw could sprint the length of a deck under winter bending. And where Liberty designs had placed stress concentrators at square corners and intersections, the newer ships softened those geometry choices, teaching the sea to press on radii rather than on knuckles, an architectural apology for the old habit of drawing rectangles into places that wanted circles. The result was not invulnerability but resilience, a hull that could take a hard cycle and return for the next one instead of cashing in all at once. Operationally, that resilience showed up as relentless reliability across theaters. The same class that ran cold North Atlantic lanes also moved through Pacific swells at a tempo that let planners assume arrival instead of hoping for it, a change so basic that it sometimes disappears into the background of victory. Post-war, the very fact that so many victories were sold into commercial service and worked on as the backbone of merchant fleets testified to a structural honesty that outlived the emergency that created them. Ships built fast can be built to last when speed is married to the right kind of strength, and these were. The Maritime Administration's record is blunt in its praise where it matters. The class delivered just over 15 knots as a baseline, lived long enough to be repainted in private colors, and proved that a war standard could become a peacetime workhorse without rewriting its bones. Museums that birth preserved victories do not merely display engines and bridge equipment, they display a philosophy, a rounded corner here, a changed frame cadence there, that resolved the welded ship's paradox and turned it into practice. Visitors see the silhouette, but what they're really looking at is the absence of a fatal flaw, the way a structure can refuse a straight path to failure by design. Back on the numbers, the comparison that matters is the one about outcomes. Early Liberty casualties taught fracture mechanics to the world, while their successors applied it, translating Charpy curves and stress-intensity logic into deck geometry and module sequencing that paid out in voyages completed rather than reports filed. That is why operational histories moved on from brittle fracture as a recurring character in winter narratives once victories took the stage, leaving the phenomenon where it belongs, in textbooks and test labs rather than in the logbooks of ships that never reached port. The sea still breaks what it must, but these hulls stopped helping it do the job. In the end, The operational proof is simple: ships that go faster spend less time in danger, and ships that flex where they should and interrupt failure where they must give danger fewer ways to turn into disaster, which is the only arithmetic that counts when convoys write history in miles. Victory ships were not miracles of luck, they were corrections made visible, of geometry, material, and method, sailed at a new pace through old weather and brought home with cargoes intact and stories unremarkable in the best possible way. What had been a headline about ships breaking became a footnote about ships working, and that is how the war's most urgent engineering lesson became, at last, routine. Legacy is what remains after the noise fades, and the welded ship crisis left something rare behind: a new language for failure that turned brittle mysteries into measurable properties, a way to design so cracks have nowhere easy to run and steel stays tough when the sea turns hard and cold. In place of blame came fracture mechanics, born from wartime investigations and distilled by figures like Constance Tipper, who showed that low-temperature notch toughness, not just workmanship, was the decisive hinge between a hull that bends and a hull that breaks. The Ship Structure Committee carried that new grammar into policy and practice, institutionalizing research and guidance so future ships would be drawn, specified, and built with the ocean's worst questions already answered on the page. The simplest tools proved the most powerful: a notched bar, a hammer, a temperature bath, and the Charpy curve that revealed where ductility fades into glassy fracture, allowing mills and navies to choose steels that keep absorbing energy at the very temperatures that once wrote Liberty tragedies in winter lanes. From those curves came procurement rules and class requirements that tied acceptance to low-temperature impact performance rather than to ambient strength alone, turning specification into prevention instead of a paper mirror for good intentions. The mills responded with fully killed, fine-grained carbon, manganese steels, cleaner, better balanced for weldability and toughness, so a deck corner in January had less chance of birthing the bright line that once sprinted across welded skins. Fracture mechanics reframed design as a contest at the crack tip: keep the stress intensity KK below the material's fracture toughness KC, blunt notches, and smooth geometry so loads are shared rather than hoarded at corners and intersections where winter loves to test a promise. That is why later ships replaced rectangles with radii and wove crack arresters into welded continuity, the interruptions that turn a seamless road into a series of cul-de-sacs, so even a born flaw runs out of ambition before it becomes a disaster. These are not mere details, they are the map that stress is forced to follow, and when the map is drawn with mercy, a hull can flex without confessing weakness to the sea. Constance Tipper's legacy is larger than a single class of ships. By demonstrating the ductile to brittle transition's role in sudden fractures, she helped steer engineering toward a discipline where temperature and notch sensitivity are first-class citizens in every design conversation. The Liberty casualties became a case study for generations: how welded continuity amplifies crack speed, how square corners hoard stress, how service conditions define material choice, lessons still recited anywhere steel must hold its nerve in the cold. History departments file the war stories, laboratories keep the data alive, and together they explain why a ship that once split at the pier reshaped what safe looks like when waves collect in February. Standards absorbed the shock as they were meant to do, with welding codes evolving from simple workmanship guides into structured demands for procedure qualification, inspector training, and essential variables that govern heat, sequence, and acceptance in structural steelwork. The modern AWSD-1. One lineage traces back to interwar and wartime efforts, then deepened through post-war revisions, codifying practice so that a neat bead is never trusted without the procedure behind it and the tests to prove it under the conditions that matter. Codes do not build ships, but they keep the worst habits out of the shed, and they give inspectors a vocabulary sharper than doubt when a joint's future is in question. The Ship Structure Committee persisted past the crisis because the sea never stops inventing new ways to ask old questions, commissioning studies from improved structural details to crack arrest strakes that quantify not only whether a fracture can be stopped, but where and under what reloads it will stay stopped. This body of work turned good ideas into design parameters, dimensions, placement, and thickness matching, so an arrestor can save a hull without becoming the next notch the ocean learns to use. It is meticulous, iterative, and unglamorous, which is exactly why it works when wind and water test the math. The legacy radiated outward beyond shipyards, into any field where metal, cold, and stress conspire, bridge and building codes that respect notch toughness and detailed categories, pressure vessel rules that tie plate acceptance to impact energy at service temperature, and pipelines specified for Arctic work with fracture control that begins at the mill. Studies of low-temperature properties and inclusion control in structural plate keep pushing toughness higher without surrendering weldability, because fabrication is part of strength, not a separate craft that design can ignore. Modern marine steels and their research records show the same through line from the 1940s. Chemistry, cleanliness, and microstructure are not boutique choices, they are life safety written at the scale of grains and inclusions. Even retrospective inquiries, such as metallurgical analyses of historic disasters, return to this grammar: temperatures, microstructures, and impact energies, because the physics that split ships in winter is the same physics that judges every structure tested at the edge of its ductility. The North is still the courtroom for these arguments, and the Charpy pendulum remains the rehearsal stage before the first wave asks the real question at scale on a dark night. In that sense, the Liberty failures never ended, they were simply turned into numbers that make modern mistakes less likely and easier to arrest. One of the quietest changes was cultural. Design and fabrication stopped treating each other as separate domains, because welding sequence, heat input, fit-up pressure, and inspection are part of the structure long before the keel sees water. Yards learned to plan for residual stress the way draftsmen plan for bending moments, and inspectors learn to read a weld as a story with a before and an after, not just a frozen surface. This is the discipline that keeps catastrophic fracture as a lesson rather than a headline, and it lives in jigs, procedures, and signatures more than in rhetoric. Victory ships, the first great beneficiaries of these lessons, sailed out a proof that design tweaks and process control could erase an entire failure mode from winter narratives, and their post-war careers as merchant workhorses were the ultimate peer review. Museums and registries list their survivors now, but the real artifact is the rounded corner you can run a hand across and the calm hull that flexes at sea the way a welded ship must if it wants to live. What was once emergency innovation hardened into standard practice, and that is the best kind of legacy, one that seems obvious only after it becomes routine. The names most widely remembered include professors and committees, but the change also belongs to those who noticed warped panels after the wrong sequence, who insisted that a weld is also a load and that heat writes memory into steel that winter will read aloud. Engineering listened, slowly and then all at once, and the conversation between yard and drawing office became a habit rather than a miracle, a loop closed before the ship meets its first storm. In the end, the legacy is not that welded ships can be built quickly, it is that they can be built to forgive, to bend, to stop a flaw and keep going, which is as close to immortality as any steel can claim in the places the ocean is most itself.